In 1884, a single commodity collapsed so violently that it turned millionaires into beggars overnight, emptied entire islands, and left behind ghost towns that still haunt the Caribbean today. But here's what nobody tells you: this wasn't a natural disaster. This was calculated. This was orchestrated. And the people who caused it, they walked away richer than ever. Before we dive in, do me a favor, type "watching from" and your country in the comments right now. I want to see how far this story reaches, because what happened in the Caribbean didn't stay in the Caribbean. It's the blueprint for every economic manipulation you see today. My name is on a channel called Vaulted Wisdom, and for the next 20 minutes, I'm going to show you how sugar, sweet, innocent sugar, became the weapon that nearly erased an entire region from the map of prosperity. And by the end, you'll understand why some economists argue this was the greatest heist in financial history. Let's go back to 1850. Picture this: you're standing on a hilltop in Barbados. Below you, endless fields of sugarcane ripple in the wind like a green ocean. The mills are churning, ships are loading, money is flowing. The year is 1850, and if you own a sugar plantation in the Caribbean, you're not just rich. You're obscenely, generationally, build a palisand, name it after yourself, rich. The Caribbean at this time controlled roughly 70% of the world's sugar supply. Think about that. 7 out of every 10 spoonfuls of sugar on Earth came from these tiny islands. Jamaica alone was producing more wealth than entire European nations. Plantation owners were sending their children to Oxford and Cambridge. They were buying estates in London. They were living like kings. But here's what made this different from other commodity booms. Sugar wasn't optional. This was before artificial sweeteners, before corn syrup, before any alternatives existed. If you wanted sugar, you bought Caribbean sugar. It was a monopoly wrapped in tropical paradise. The numbers were staggering. A single estate in Trinidad could generate what would be $15 million a year in today's money. Workers, and let's be clear about what that word meant then, we'll get to that, were processing tons of cane daily. The refineries ran 24 hours. The ports never slept. And everyone knew it was built on something ugly. The sugar islands had been built on the backs of enslaved people for 2 centuries. By 1850, slavery was being abolished across the British Caribbean, but the economic structure, that barely changed. Former enslaved people became indentured laborers. Indians and Chinese workers were brought in under contracts that were slavery in everything but name. The exploitation didn't end. It just got rebranded. But the money kept flowing, and when money flows like that, people get comfortable, they get arrogant, they assume it'll last forever. It never does. The first warning sign came from an unexpected place, a laboratory in Germany. In 1747, a chemist named Andreas Marggraf discovered something that should have terrified every Caribbean plantation owner. He found that you could extract sugar from beets, not tropical plants that need specific climates, not crops that require year-round warmth. Beets, vegetables that grow in cold European soil. For decades, nobody cared. The process was expensive. The yield was low. Caribbean sugar was still cheaper and better, but technology has a funny way of improving when there's profit involved. By the 1830s, European farmers had figured out how to grow sugar beets efficiently. France started subsidizing beet sugar production, then Germany, then Austria, then Russia. Suddenly, Europe didn't need the Caribbean anymore. They could grow their own sugar in their own backyard. The Caribbean plantation owners watched their market share start to slip. In 1840, they controlled 70% of world supply. By 1860, it was down to 50%. By 1870, it was 35%. But they told themselves it was temporary. They told themselves European beet sugar was inferior. They told themselves consumers would always prefer the real thing. They were wrong on all counts. And then came the second problem: Cuba. Cuba was the one Spanish colony still operating under full slavery. While British and French Caribbean islands had to pay laborers, Cuban plantation owners paid nothing. Their costs were a fraction. They could undercut everyone. Cuban sugar flooded the market, and suddenly Jamaican and Barbadian plantations couldn't compete on price. The third problem was even worse: technology. The old Caribbean estates were running on equipment from the 1700s: windmills, animal-powered crushers, manual processing. Meanwhile, new sugar operations in places like Louisiana and Brazil were installing steam-powered mills that could process 10 times the cane in half the time. The Caribbean was getting outmaneuvered on every front, but the plantation owners had spent generations believing they were untouchable. They had generational wealth, they had land, they had infrastructure. How bad could it really get? They were about to find out. The year was 1884, and sugar prices were already falling. They'd been falling for a decade, slowly, steadily, like a plane losing altitude. But in October of that year, something broke. It started with a bank in London called the West India Bank. This institution had financed Caribbean sugar for generations. They held mortgages on hundreds of plantations. They had loans out to refineries, shipping companies, equipment manufacturers, everyone connected to the sugar trade. On October 14th, the bank announced it was insolvent, broke, done. The news hit the Caribbean like a hurricane. Overnight, plantations couldn't get credit, they couldn't buy equipment, they couldn't pay workers. Ships wouldn't transport their sugar without payment up front, but refineries wouldn't buy their sugar without testing it first, and they couldn't afford the storage costs while waiting. The whole system seized up like an engine without oil. And then the vultures arrived. European financiers who had been waiting for exactly this moment swept in. They bought up estates for pennies on the dollar. They foreclosed on properties that had been in families for 5 generations. They took over refineries, ports, shipping lines, everything. But here's the truly evil part, and this is where it becomes more than just a market crash. There's evidence this was engineered. Records that surfaced decades later showed that European beet sugar producers had been coordinating to drive down prices. They knew Caribbean estates were overleveraged. They knew the banks were shaky, so they dumped product. They sold below cost, taking losses they could afford, knowing the Caribbean plantations couldn't survive a prolonged price war. It worked. Between 1884 and 1890. Sugar prices collapsed by 60%. Estates that had been worth millions became worthless. Families that had lived in luxury for generations were suddenly destitute, and the Caribbean economy imploded. Let me take you to Antigua in 1886, 2 years after the crash began. There's an estate called Betty's Hope, one of the oldest and most profitable plantations on the island. For 200 years, this place had been an economic engine. At its peak, it employed 400 people. It had its own village, its own church, its own school. By 1886, it's abandoned. The great house is empty, the mill is silent, the fields are overgrown, the village is a ghost town. This wasn't unique. Across the Caribbean, estates were being abandoned at a rate of 1 per week, and when an estate shut down, it wasn't just the owner who suffered. Hundreds of workers lost their jobs. The local shopkeepers lost their customers. The doctors and teachers left because there was nobody to serve. Entire communities evaporated. The human migration that followed was one of the largest in Caribbean history. Between 1880 and 1920, an estimated 500,000 people left the islands looking for work. They went to Central America to build railroads. They went to Panama to dig the canal. They went to the United States. They went anywhere there might be opportunity because there was none left at home. The islands that stayed behind changed completely. In Jamaica, the population actually decreased for the first time in recorded history. Villages that had existed for centuries disappeared from maps. Schools closed. Churches closed. Roads fell into disrepair because there was no tax base to maintain them. And the worst part, the people who caused this, the European financiers, the beet sugar barons, the banks, they moved on to the next opportunity. They took their profits and invested elsewhere. To them, this was just business, just markets working as intended. But if you were Caribbean, this was apocalypse. Now here's where this story gets controversial. and where I need you to think critically about what happened. The standard narrative is that this was inevitable, that the Caribbean sugar industry was inefficient and outdated, and that market forces naturally corrected this. That's what the economics textbooks will tell you. But let's look at who benefited. European beet sugar companies, which had been subsidized by their governments, suddenly dominated the market. The refineries in London and Amsterdam that bought cheap Caribbean estates now controlled production from crop to shelf. The banks that foreclosed on properties flipped them to European investors at massive profits. And the Caribbean, it became what economists call a dependent economy. Instead of producing and profiting from their own resources, the islands became suppliers of cheap raw materials. The value-added processing, where the real money is made, moved to Europe and North America. This is the blueprint that would be repeated across the developing world for the next century. You've seen this pattern before. It happened with rubber in the Congo, with coffee in South America, with oil in the Middle East. A region develops a valuable commodity. Foreign interests move in. A financial crisis is triggered or exploited. The local economy collapses. Foreign interests buy everything at fire-sale prices. The profits leave and never come back. Some historians argue this wasn't just a market failure. It was economic colonialism. The British had lost political control of many Caribbean islands by the 1880s, but through financial manipulation, they regained economic control. And economic control is often more powerful than political control because it's invisible. There's no flag to rally against, no governor to overthrow, just market forces which sound natural and inevitable. But there was nothing natural about subsidizing European beet sugar while Caribbean cane sugar received no support. There was nothing inevitable about banks that had survived for centuries suddenly collapsing at the exact moment it would most benefit European investors. The sugar crash of 1884 was presented as a tragedy, but for some people, it was a very successful business plan. Let's jump forward to today. You might be thinking, okay, this is interesting history, but what does it matter now? That was 140 years ago. Here's what it matters. The Caribbean never fully recovered. Look at the economic data. Before 1880, several Caribbean islands had higher per capita income than parts of Europe. Today, despite being tourist destinations that appear prosperous, most Caribbean nations are classified as developing economies. They have high debt. They depend on imports for basic goods. They're vulnerable to external economic shocks. Why? Because the foundation was destroyed in the 1880s and never rebuilt. The manufacturing base that could have developed never did because the capital was extracted. The agricultural diversity that could have provided stability never happened because the land was consolidated under foreign ownership and used for single crops. The financial institutions that could have provided local investment never grew strong because European banks maintained control. And here's the really uncomfortable truth. This pattern continues today. Let me give you a current example. In 2010, Jamaica had to take a loan from the International Monetary Fund. The conditions, austerity measures that cut government spending on education and healthcare, privatization of state assets, opening markets to foreign competition, the exact same playbook from the 1880s. When Jamaica was vulnerable, external forces came in with capital, but the capital came with conditions that benefited the lenders, not Jamaica. I'm not making a political statement here. I'm pointing out a pattern. When developing economies are in crisis, capital from developed economies arrives not as charity but as investment, and investment demands return. The question is, returns for whom? The sugar crash taught us that markets don't naturally trend toward fairness. They trend toward power. And whoever has the power during a crisis can restructure the entire economy to their benefit, and that restructuring can last for generations. I want to end with something tangible, something you can visit today if you want proof this really happened. Scattered across the Caribbean are the ruins of the great estates. You can walk through them. Betty's Hope in Antigua is a museum now. The windmill still stands, but it doesn't turn. Plantation in the Virgin Islands looks like a movie set for a post-apocalyptic film. In Jamaica, there are dozens of great houses slowly being reclaimed by jungle. These aren't ancient ruins from lost civilizations. These were operational, profitable businesses just 150 years ago. Your great-great-grandparents could have visited them at their peak. They had electricity. They had modern equipment. They employed thousands. And then, in less than a decade, they became ruins. That's how fast an economy can be destroyed. That's how quickly wealth that took centuries to build can vanish. Not because of war, not because of natural disaster, because of markets, because of debt, because of coordinated economic pressure from more powerful interests. The ruins stand as a warning. They say, this can happen, this has happened, this could happen again. Because here's the final, uncomfortable question this whole story raises. We like to think that modern economies are more stable, that we have regulations and institutions that prevent these kinds of crashes. But do we? In 2008, the global financial crisis wiped out trillions in wealth. Entire countries like Greece and Iceland nearly collapsed. And who got bailout out? The banks, the same institutions that caused the crisis. The little guy, the homeowner who lost their house, the worker who lost their job, they got austerity. The pattern never changes, the technology changes, the commodities change, the countries change, but the fundamental dynamic, wealth flowing from the vulnerable to the powerful during times of crisis, that stays the same. So what's the lesson from the Caribbean sugar crash of 1884? It's that economics is never just about supply and demand. It's about power. It's about who controls the capital, who controls the markets, who controls the narrative. The Caribbean plantation owners thought they were too big to fail. They thought their monopoly was unbreakable. They thought their wealth was permanent. They were wrong. And the people who replaced them, they understood something the plantation owners didn't. That wealth isn't about what you produce. It's about what you control. The beet sugar producers didn't make better sugar. They controlled governments that subsidized them. The banks didn't provide better service. They controlled the capital during a crisis. The refineries didn't process more efficiently. They controlled the distribution networks. Control beats production every single time. This is why studying history matters, not because the past is fascinating, though it is, but because the patterns repeat. If you understand how the Caribbean was economically dismantled in the 1880s, you can recognize the early warning signs when it starts happening to your country, your industry, your community. You can see the signs when major players are being subsidized, when local industries are being undercut by foreign competition that can afford to lose money, when banks start tightening credit right as external investment arrives, when the narrative shifts from this is temporary to this is inevitable. The sugar crash nearly destroyed the Caribbean. It absolutely changed it forever. Some islands never recovered their pre-1880 prosperity. Some communities ceased to exist. Some families went from generational wealth to poverty in a single generation. And it was all legal. It was all just markets working as designed. Nobody went to jail. Nobody was held accountable. The system worked exactly as intended if you understand that the system was designed to concentrate wealth, not distribute it. So here's my question for you, the one that actually matters. If the same pattern played out today, where a developing region's entire economy collapsed because powerful financial interests wanted control of their resources, would you recognize it? Or would you believe it was just market forces working naturally? Type your answer in the comments, one word, one sentence, just your honest thought. Because that's the test of whether we've learned anything. The Caribbean sugar crash isn't ancient history, it's a case study, and the exam is open book. All the information is available. The question is, are we paying attention? If you made it this far, you're part of a rare group. Most people won't watch a 25-minute video about economic history, but you did, which means you're curious, you're willing to look deeper. That makes you dangerous to people who profit from ignorance. Subscribe to Vaulted Wisdom if you want more stories like this, economic history that matters, told like it actually happened, No sugarcoating. No pun intended. Drop that comment. Tell me if you'd recognize this pattern today. Let's see if we're smarter than the Caribbean plantation owners in 1880. I'll see you in the next one.